Hey, and welcome. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. Got a lot coming up for you this hour. A little bit later on in the hour, we'll take your calls at 855-236-3228. That's 855-236-3228. Joining us on the line is Governor Larry Hogan. He is the 62nd governor of Maryland, overwhelmingly reelected to a second four-year term, receiving the most votes of any Maryland gubernatorial candidate. He's the only the second Republican governor reelected in the 242-year history of the state of Maryland. He has a brand new book out as well called Still Standing, Surviving Cancer, Riots, a Global Pandemic, and the Toxic Politics That Divide America. Governor Hogan, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thank you, Ben. It's good to be with you.
So why don't we begin with the status of COVID? Obviously, this has become the object of chief concern for most Americans. How's it going in your state? So I'm looking at the sort of uptick in cases. It seems like there's an uptick in cases nearly everywhere. The information I'm seeing from the New York Times database suggests that you've seen an uptick from about 300 cases in late June to over 1,000 in the last couple of days. To what do you attribute that, and how are things going over there?
Well, we're in relatively good shape compared to what we're seeing in a lot of states. Most of the uptick in cases is due to the fact that we've increased the amount of testing by about 400%. Just in recent weeks. So we were doing less than, we were doing about 8,000 tests a day. We're now up to 30 to 35,000 tests a day. So obviously we're finding more cases. The key numbers we're looking at are things like the positivity rate, which has been relatively flat and slightly declining over the past 6 weeks. And we reached our peak about 96 days ago. We're down below what the CDC recommended guidelines are. We're about 4.5% on our positivity, which is, there are a number of states now that are in the 20s. But we're still watching it very vigilantly. I mean, we're concerned. We do have a couple of concerning things, like among young people, 35 and younger. We're starting to see a rise, even though we're seeing a decline with people over 35. And we're starting to see a slight uptick in hospitalizations and younger people being hospitalized, which is a big change from what we were seeing before.
Now, when it comes to hospitalizations, the new daily reported deaths they continue to be incredibly low. So back when this was at its height, back in May, you were experiencing in your state, reported deaths of 50, 60. Now you're still down in single digits. Do you expect that to rise?
Well, I had a good call with a bunch of our public health doctors and epidemiologists and folks from all of our hospitals earlier today, and I had the same question because it's one of the things we're concerned about. Interestingly, I mean, we're making real progress with respect to some of the therapeutics, and because in the early stages, a lot of our cases were people in their 70s and 80s, and they were coming from nursing homes. They had underlying conditions, and they were going immediately into ICU and on ventilators. Now we're seeing 50% of our cases almost are younger people, less than 40, and they're healthier. They're still sick enough to go in the hospital, but they're not sick enough that where they're likely to die. We still have some folks dying, but not nearly in the same kinds of numbers, and they're not sick enough to go into ICU beds. But it is concerning that we're filling up more hospital beds, and that younger people are sick enough to have to go to the hospital.
We're speaking with Governor Larry Hogan. His new book is Still Standing, Survivor Cancer, Riots, Global Pandemic, and the Toxic Politics That Divide America. So, Governor Hogan, what's your perspective on schooling? Obviously, that's become a really hot-button issue in a variety of states. Should public schools open? How should they reopen? What do you think is the solution here?
Yeah, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution, and I agree with where most people probably believe, and I believe that we should do everything we can to try to get our kids back in the classroom if we can do so in a safe way. I think it's really difficult to not have kids back and having the experience of being back in the classroom. However, we can't do it if it's not going to keep them safe, and it's different in different parts of the country, obviously, and in different types of school systems. So we're following the CDC guidelines. We had a great meeting with the vice president. We have another call today, actually, with the vice president, all the governors, and the coronavirus task force. But the CDC put out really good guidelines about how to keep kids safe, had a lot of flexibility. We have a state plan we put out about a month ago that let our local school systems have some flexibility, and they're putting in draft plans. Some of our more urban centers with higher populations are making recommendations about doing more distance learning online, and some of our more rural, smaller school boards are trying to get kids back in the classrooms, and some of them are going to be a little bit of a hybrid, I think, where we're bringing in kids on a rotating basis, so we don't have a full packed classroom, but maybe a couple of days, and then do some online learning from home. But it's a very difficult situation because we really want to make sure we err on the side of getting the kids the best education we can and trying to get them back as much as possible, but not doing it in a way that's unsafe.
So, Governor Hogan, obviously you've made a lot of headlines recently because you've been pretty critical of the Trump administration's response to COVID. What do you think the Trump administration did right, and what did they do wrong here?
Well, so yeah, I have a book that I was talking about the early stages of the pandemic, and some of that was picked up as current criticism. But I think they've made great strides and made real improvements lately. And I've tried to praise the Trump administration when they've done things that I think are right. And so on the things that on the early stages, I think the president didn't take the crisis seriously enough. I think his messaging was wrong when he was saying things like, it's just the sniffles and it's only 15 people and soon it'll disappear. And he was, making fun of masking and distancing. And his people in his administration were taking it very seriously. We were having meetings with the vice president and folks from the CDC and the HHS, and they were really raising the alarms with the governors, but the president would say things that were the opposite. And I think that was a mistake at the beginning. I think not having a national testing strategy early on and not trying to get on top of this in the first few months was probably a mistake. But I think they've made real strides on a couple of things they've done a great job on. Recently, I think they've made utilizing the Defense Production Act to ramp up the production of ventilators was great, and that's no longer an issue or a problem. And utilizing that to produce swabs, which seems like a simple thing, but there was only, I think, one place in Italy that was producing these critical things for testing, and they ramped up the production here in the United States, which was a life-saving step. And now we're light years ahead on the development of a vaccine, thanks to the efforts of the administration, with Operation Warp Speed, which I think has been terrific. We've got about 20 different companies here in just my state of Maryland that are working on potential vaccines, which, if we really want to get our economy back on track, we want to get kids back in school, we want to try to get life back to normal, it is going to take us developing a vaccine that works. And so I think they've been really making strides in the right direction. Frankly, I think the president's new messaging recently has changed for the better. And, he is changing his messaging, his strategy. He's been wearing a mask and telling people it's patriotic. I think that's all positive stuff in the right direction.
We're speaking with Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland. His new book is still standing, Surviving Cancer, Riots, a Global Pandemic, and the Toxic Politics That Divide America. Well, speaking of things that really should unite us but are dividing us in idiotic fashion, Governor Hogan, what do you make of the vast spate of unrest that has been plaguing major cities across the country, and what do you make of the federal response to it? It seems like this should be an area where pretty much everybody is unified. If you're protesting legally, that's fine. And if you start firing rockets and fireworks at federal courthouse buildings, at that point you should be arrested. I'm unsure as to why this has polarized our politics.
Well, really, it's kind of unbelievable. I mean, I talk about this a lot in my book because there are real parallels, to a situation that I had in 2015. I have about 5 chapters about this. When I had only been governor for 89 days, when the worst violence in 47 years broke out in our largest city of Baltimore after the death of Freddie Gray. This was at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, and we had a young man who died in police custody. And so this was right after Ferguson. And we had, just in the first few hours, we had about 400 businesses and homes, buildings destroyed and burned and looted, and 127 police and firefighters were injured. The city police were overwhelmed and unable to respond, and I immediately declared a state of emergency, and I sent in 4,000 members of the National Guard and 1,000 police officers, and we really were able to bring law and order and peace and calm, kept the citizens of Baltimore safe. We allowed for peaceful protests to continue unabated, for a solid week, but we immediately stopped all the violence, and no more bricks, and no more fires, and no more looting, and no more people getting hurt. And I write about this book. I actually, after that, taught a course at the National Governors Association to new governors about how to respond to a crisis like that. But it seems as if some of our mayors and our governors are not paying attention. I think there was a fine line between making sure, and I think we found the right balance in Baltimore, to not inflame the situation by overreacting, but certainly the kind of hands-off response to allow lawlessness in the streets to take over your cities for weeks on end is just completely unacceptable. And so, I think you have to make the differentiation between there are an awful lot of real, legitimate, peaceful protesters that are expressing their frustration, and then there's anarchists and people that are committing crimes out in the streets, and we shouldn't confuse the two of them, and we ought to make sure that we let the protests that are peaceful take place and protect them and protect their right to do that, but make sure we stop the anarchists that are vandalizing and endangering property and people.
Governor Larry Hogan, his book is Still Standing: Surviving Cancer, Riots, a Global Pandemic, and the Toxic Politics That Divide America. So considering a lot of this is commonsensical, and yet common sense apparently has fled, you talk a lot in your book about how to unify America, what a program for the Republican Party would look like going forward that would be more unifying and that might have a broader consensus. What does that look like?
Well, I think some of it is, I'm a big Reagan guy. I was a chairman of Youth for Reagan. I was a Reagan delegate a couple of times, and I just think some of it is on the tone and the messaging and how we go about being Reagan always often talked about a bigger tent, and how do we appeal to a broader base of people. Haley Barbour, who's a good friend, a former governor who was the chairman of the Republican National Committee. One of my favorite quotes of his is that successful politics is about addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division. And I just think sometimes we could do a better job of not doing as much dividing and avoiding a little bit of the inflammatory, divisive rhetoric and trying to do a better job. It's not so much changing our principles. You want to stand up for the things that you believe in and things that are important, but maybe lowering the temperature on the political rhetoric, because I think many people are just frustrated with that kind of angry rhetoric on both sides of the aisle, and they just want to see people fix the problems and work together and get things done. It's what I've tried to do in my state. I'm in a very blue state, probably the bluest state in America, and I've been able to win a couple of elections here that were nearly impossible to win because we've reached out. I've gone into the black community and won big support. I've gotten Democrats and independents to cross over and won suburban women. And I think for the Republican Party to be successful in the future, we've got to find a way to talk to a wider audience than just our base. We do. I think sometimes we do a really good job of firing up our base, but we don't do such a good job of reaching out and growing the party. And in order for us to win elections in the future and be able to continue to lead, we're going to have to be able to win over more people.
Governor Larry Hogan, his book is Still Standing: Surviving Cancer, Riots, a Global Pandemic, and the Toxic Politics That Divide America. Appreciate your time, Governor Hogan, and good luck going forward.
Thank you, Ben.